So, when I was younger, before I got married, we had a house that we all lived together, about 4 or 5 guys, and it was known as the bachelor pad, right? And, you know, there were certain movies that guys really like. So up there was obviously Gladiator with Maximus. Like, he is going against the emperor, and he's standing up for that injustice, and Commodus is this horrible guy. And then there's Braveheart, right, with William Wallace. Freedom, right? We won't mention how he gets disemboweled at the end, but, right, you wanted to be William Wallace. So for me in my classrooms, my students, those were like, I used to talk to them about the William Wallace moments. We're not all born with character and this desire to put ourselves on the line. It's taught. It's learned about. Then there's Gladiator. Not Gladiator, I already said that. Then there's the 300, right? When we start talking about the Spartans. And Leonidas is going against Xerxes the First, the Persian leader who believes he is a god. And the waves of Persian soldiers, the immortals they call them, coming against the 300 Spartans, and Leonidas continues to push them back. So I want you to understand who Xerxes is. The Xerxes of the movie 300 is the Xerxes that is about 6 months after that is the Xerxes that Esther is going before. It's the same Xerxes who, after so many days, could not defeat the 300, did kill Leonidas, and did go on to burn Athens, but eventually would be defeated and would go back to Persia in defeat. He's the same Xerxes who had a bridge built across a Hellespont, and then a storm wiped it away, and he felt he was so powerful that he ordered his soldiers to whip and beat the ocean. That is the Xerxes that we're talking about. So when he's celebrating his greatness, and he puts his queen out because she wouldn't come before him. Realize who Xerxes is. He is a historical person who saw himself as divine. And you have this amazing intertwining of a story masterfully written in the book of Esther. And I want you to realize, go read through the book of Esther. It never mentions God. Yet, you might have the most beautiful intertwining of a story that shows God in every way. And before Esther could stand up, Mordecai continued to stand up for justice. Mordecai took in the orphan, his niece, Esther. Her parents had died, but he stood up and he raised her as his own. He taught her the ways of God. He taught her to have character. Then Mordecai would hang out in the gate of the king, and he would hear all these people talking, and he hears about a plot to kill Xerxes, and he stands up and he informs the advisors of the king that there's a plot out there at his own risk. So this is Esther is seeing this in her uncle. Then you have this whole situation where he's at the gate, and Haman, one of the great advisors of the king, filled with loftiness, no humility, every day as he passes through the gate to get to the court of the king, everyone just kneels down at him and bows down in supplication but not Mordecai. Once again, Mordecai stands up. He stands up for justice. He doesn't, we don't hear why doesn't Mordecai kneel? But it's because he only bows down to God. And he's going to be strong in that. So, kind of being a young man in the bachelor house, we would get together, we'd watch this movies, and geez, I want to be William Wallace. I want to be Leonidas. Right? I want to be Maximus. I want to stand up against that. Then we should add Mordecai and Esther to that list. So you have a situation now. Mordecai comes to Esther, and I can only imagine what that conversation is like about how Mordecai, how he's raised Esther, and those examples of who he is and what they believe. So in this situation, just really quickly, he's like, don't think you're not here as the queen, right, through the whole process because God hasn't put you here, because God has put Esther there. And then we start seeing this intertwining, right? She says, yeah, I will go before the king. I will go before Xerxes. She hasn't seen him in 30 days. She is called at his behest. It's not her who goes to him, right? And to do that, you're putting your life on the line. So you have this whole situation. So she goes and she stands there waiting, and he sees her and he calls her. And what is your request? And he offers her up to half his kingdom. Now, it didn't mean he was going to give half his kingdom, by the way. It was kind of a saying. In other words, I will grant you your wish. And she says, I want to invite you to a feast. I want to invite you into my quarters, into my area of the palace for a feast, and bring Haman with you. Right? Now Haman's there, and Haman's like, my gosh, what an amazing honor that the queen is inviting me. Then it disperses. So Esther's going to go. She's planning this feast. Haman goes back to his home, starts talking to his wife about, wow, and his advisors, I've been invited to this. But a little thing happens. And we start to see, remember that intercession? Remember that last week we interceded for people? And remember that Esther had said, hey, you know what? Have the people pray for me and fast for 3 days. For intercession. She has a faith that God is going to show up. She's scared. There's fear there. There's real cause for death. There's risk. So now, just from a literary standpoint, if you start looking at Esther, you see this intertwining of stories that are overlapping. So you have Haman goes home, and he's bragging about that he's going with Xerxes and the queen. He's been invited. Obviously, it's because he's amazing. Esther goes home and prepares. Xerxes goes back to his palace after a long day and lays down to sleep. As Haman was leaving, of course, he had to pass through the gate. And who was there but Mordecai? That Mordecai. And this anger built up in him. And he started to plot. It's like, this Mordecai doesn't bow down to me. He's still there. Remember, Haman had already tricked Xerxes into having him agree that they would have these people wiped out. He didn't identify that they were the Jews that were going to be wiped out. Not to mention that the Jews played an integral role in the Persian society. This was really going to hurt Persia economically, right through the ripple of society. You have a very large Jewish population. So now, Xerxes does not realize it's the Jewish people. Haman does not know that Mordecai is the uncle of the queen. Xerxes and Haman do not know that Esther is Jewish. So you have all this going on. And you have a God who's not mentioned, but you can see his fingerprints all over the whole thing. So it gets better. How many of you at night have laid in bed unable to sleep because your troubles of your day or your life are just playing through your mind? Show me your hands. All of us. So Xerxes is in his chamber and he cannot sleep. Now, a lot of you, if you're like me, all of a sudden you turn on ESPN and you start flipping through. No. Okay, maybe you don't. But, right, that's my thing. Like in the middle of the night, I might start looking through that and looking at the scores or reading something. And eventually I hope I fall asleep. So there's Xerxes. Well, he didn't have screen time. He didn't have a phone. He didn't have an iPhone. He didn't have an iPad. He didn't have ESPN. He didn't have any of those things. But what he does have is servants. And he has scribes. And what they do is they record everything about his life and his kingdom that they do. So he calls in one of the scribes and he says, read to me something that has happened. So a lot of times, royalty at the time didn't even know how to read. But they had their scribes who were able to do that. So for whatever reason, the story of a man in his kingdom who had uncovered a plot to assassinate Xerxes is the story that starts to be read in the night before he's going in to have a dinner with Esther, where we all know Esther is going to ask for the salvation of the Jewish people. And Xerxes says, stop. What do you, wait a minute. He says to the scribe, what was ever done to honor this person who did this? And he doesn't even know it's Mordecai. And they're like, well, we never did anything. He's like, he yells out, what advisor is in my court right now? And it was early in the morning, and so let's just park that for a second. Now, back with Haman. Haman, goes home, brags about the meal that he's going to have with the queen, and then all of a sudden he sees in the gate, he sees Mordecai. He gets all upset in all his pride, and he starts planning. That's it. That Mordecai, he goes to he had a lot of power, so he went to some workers. He said, build the gallows. Tomorrow, I'm going to put him to death. So he has a gallows built. And I want you to realize, when we talk about the gallows, we are not talking about hanging, right? We listen to that. If we go back in American history, we talk about the gallows. We know they built a stage and then you hung. That's not what the gallows were in the Persian Empire. It's a precursor to crucifixion, but it's only one stick and it's sharpened at one end, and you're pulled down by your legs until it comes out your throat, the stick. So this was nasty. This is brutal. So he has that done, and he's coming, and it's early in the morning, and he's in the courts of the Persian king. And just so happens, all of a sudden, the scribes say, well, Haman, your top advisor, is in your court right now. Have him come in. So Xerxes says, Haman, what would a king of Persia do to honor someone that he wants to honor for a great deed? Well, so Haman obviously thinks it's him. So he says, well, I would give him the best robe that your king has worn. I would lead him through the city, people cheering. So Xerxes turns around to him and says, Haman, go and do that for Mordecai. Xerxes doesn't know that Mordecai is the one who's going to be impaled by Haman. Xerxes doesn't know that Mordecai is the one who wouldn't bow down to Haman, and therefore now the Jewish people in Persia are in peril. All in one night, the night before Esther is going to stand in and ask for the Jewish people to be saved. So think about that. God is never mentioned in Esther, but God lives in Esther. So we're going to come back to that story because we're going to talk about faith in action and trusting God. Now, Esther doesn't know what happens in the king's chambers that night in the dream and the scribe. She doesn't know that Mordecai is being prepared to be impaled. She doesn't know how the scribe came in and read about that. So the next event comes. They go and they have this feast with the queen, and they're drinking, they're eating, and obviously Haman is distraught about the Mordecai thing, but at least he is here and he is being honored with the presence of the queen and the king. And then finally, you have the story of Xerxes asking her, what is your request? So if you can put up the first slide, we're going to look at that. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Then Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. I want to stop right there. Just leave it up there. I want you to think about this. When you were going to ask the king, like literally, if you angered that king, he could put you to death. If you were questioning his edicts, he could put you to death. There is great cost. There is great risk in what she is doing. Think about this right now. Have any of you ever been put in a position that you are called upon to expose something, that you've been called upon for a position of integrity or justice? I think about this, right, as a teacher. Middle school teacher, nonetheless, really hyperactive kids running around, right? And there's always situations where I'm kind of just looking and I see situations happen where I know kids have been taught what they should do, but they will not do. I was walking down the hall 2 weeks ago, and there's in the middle of the hall, there's a crowd of kids, and I'm figuring they're just changing classes. And I go up, and in the middle of, there's a kid crawled up in the fetal position crying. And right away, my anger gets going. I don't know what's happened. My anger gets going, and I just, I lean down, you are right. And then I said something to the kids like, why are you all standing around? Why isn't anyone helping this person? And I sent them all out to another room, and then myself and another teacher helped the child. But that's a situation every single one of you, just like Esther, are placed in your life. And there's that question that Sean talked about, fear versus love. What do you choose? I know many times in my life I have chosen fear and I have not stepped up. I know times in my life I have chosen courage and stood up. I also know every single one of you are Esther. You are in a position right now in your life where God has placed you. Whether you think God has placed you in that position or not, you are. And it might not come to light today. It might be a week from now. It might be a month from now. But the position that you are in is where you need to be and where you need to make a difference. When I first came to Christ, I remember being afraid of God. I was like, oh God, I really like my life. I like where I am. I like what I'm doing. You're going to move me. You're going to send me to some other part of the world. You're going to do all these things. And I was afraid until I realized God had already put me in the place I needed to be. So when I look at Haman and Esther and Xerxes, the night before they get together, God has already positioned you. God is a God who has a relationship with you. And when you ask him to intercede, and you pray about that, and you put yourself before God, God moves. Justice. Now we go back to this. This is the petition. Spare my people. This is my request. All right? So now what you're going to see with this is she's going to request that her people be saved. What about us? When we step up and we talk about justice, it doesn't always mean saving everyone. We don't always have an Esther situation. It might be a small thing. There's always a risk that's involved. Are we willing to take that risk? This is the key point with Esther. She's going to stand up for justice. In our society, there's a lot of people groups. There's a lot for me, for my position, it's my students. That's where God has placed me. Am I going to stand up for what's right in those situations? Am I going to have have integrity at all times? You guys need to think about that. Where are you? What is your situation? What is the risk that you have? Are you willing to do like Esther? Take the risk. Is it worth it? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, World War II. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is an amazing individual. He was born in the early 1900s. In his early teenage years, he's born in Germany, in Berlin. World War I happens, and he's really scarred by that. And he decides he's going to go into seminary and become a theologian, even though he came from an aristocratic family. And he really believes in the concept of faith is an action. Faith in action. So in 1933, Hitler comes into power. And where everyone else is caught with this amazing euphoria of this speaker and bringing Germany back to its greatness and the Aryan nation, and how the Jews are a problem and the persecution of the Jews. This is 1933. He starts to speak up against it. He took a step for justice, even though, and he believed in faith in action. At one point, in 1936, he leaves Germany. He goes to the United States because he's like, I cannot be in this place. My soul is breaking for the German church. And all the people who are just following this. He lasts 26 days in the United States. And he goes right back to Germany. He said, no, I have to be there. I have to be in the middle of the darkness. I have to be that light in the darkness who's screaming out, this isn't right. Where are we with the situations that are in your life? Are we Esther? Are we the Bonhoeffers in our society? And that's for you to judge. That's a question, an open question. If you can turn to the next slide. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Who is this man who has dared to do such a thing? Now, you know when he says such a thing, she's exposed the plot of Haman to eradicate the Jews. Esther said, this is an adversary, an enemy. It's him, Haman. Now, this is the problem. This is risk. This is, you can't imagine, Haman is a good advisor, a powerful advisor. Esther isn't just accusing someone. She's accusing the second most powerful man in one of the greatest empires that humanity has ever known. The Persians. So by accusing Haman, she's putting her life completely on the line. 100%. Not only that, a king doesn't always think with his heart, right? Let's face it, there's economics involved, there's power involved, there's risk, there's reward. If I get rid of Haman's making this empire great. Haman is a good advisor, brutal, but a good advisor. Second in command to Xerxes. Put that on the line. This isn't just her job on the line. I'm sure a lot of you have been in a position where you've seen something at your work that was not right, that integrity was not being held up, where dishonesty was there, that the goal was not being met and it was being lied about, that something bad was happening, an integrity issue. I'm sure some of you are going to see that this year, this month, this week. What are you going to do? There's a risk. You may lose your job. Esther was going to lose her life. This was salvation for the Jews of Persia. I hope you also see the precursor to Jesus. It plays over and over in the scripture, the sacrifice that God continues to bring in for his people. It's a recurring theme throughout the scriptures. And us as Christians are called to continue. You're not always going to be crucified, but you may suffer. What is your choice going to be? Esther has no idea what's going to happen with this. It's the vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. You have to understand now that Haman literally has become the enemy of the queen. And now it's been exposed. He persecuted the people of the queen. Dietrich Bonhoeffer came back to Germany. He was banned. He couldn't teach, couldn't find a job. He was a pastor. The Germans had taken over the Christian churches. He couldn't even preach, but yet he was out there. Faith in action. He risked everything coming back to that place, just like Esther was risking everything, just like we're called to stand up for the vulnerable, where there is no justice. Can you put up the third slide? The king got up. Yep, I couldn't see that because of the sun. The king got up in rage, left his wine and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind, and he begged the queen for his life. Esther's courage was not for herself. It was not about whether she was going to live or die. It was for her people. It was for the other. When we go through situations like this, we're called to trust God. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how it's going to play out. Esther didn't know how it was going to play out. She just knew it was right what she was going to do according to God, to how Mordecai had raised her. She took a stand. She did not know. What about you? This is a challenge to all of us. Can we be an Esther? Can we be a Mordecai? What is that situation? Before I pray, I'll end on this. I'll go back to those movies that me and my roommates really love. And there was this one scene that just, I always just puts goosebumps on my neck. And it's from Braveheart. And it's William Wallace before one of these final battles. And he's riding his horse back and forth in front of his men. And some of them want to leave and not fight. And I don't have the exact quote, but he basically says, fine, you can leave. And some of you might leave. But when you leave, many years from now, lying in your beds, will it basically have been worth it? Because you sold it all. Was your integrity worth it? Was it worth it? Did you really gain your freedom? So Esther, it wasn't about her, but it was for the people. The marginalized, the vulnerable, the orphans, the kids who need mentors, the poor, the drug addicts, the refugees. We can compile a list and then add those people in your lives that you need to stand up for, no matter what the risk. Lord, I just thank you for this series, Lord. I pray, Lord, that your Spirit just comes over all of us, Lord, so that we would be those, that we would be Esthers, we would be Mordecais, that we would be willing to take a stand no matter what the risk for those who cannot stand for themselves. In Jesus' name, amen.